We got a full house today. You guys all came out to sit in that great outdoors with all the gypsy moths, and yeah, we had gypsy moths in Texas, and then I woke up from that nightmare. So, meaning we didn't. When I first moved up here and I see all these crazy cobweb-looking things up in the trees, it blew my mind. And then Shauna explained to me what they were, and I guess now they're kind of like lanternflies. They're just everywhere. So today I wanted to talk about, and it's kind of timely because we were talking earlier, about what's going on in the land of Israel right now, and there was discussion about who is Israel, and so part of that is when you endeavor to become an Israelite in the spirit, you want to do Israelite things. If you're going to follow the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, you want to do things that he does, he says to do. And so I remember when I started doing this back in 2005, of course, the first thing that I did was I started in February of that year, and of course, started keeping Sabbath, and then of course the next thing that rolls around is Passover. And so we're gearing up for Passover, and we had 2 or 3 people, I can't remember their names, I don't even remember who it was, but we had 2 or 3 people that were like, since we're not like in the land, you don't have to do Passover, you don't have to do the feast. And it's like, okay, I hadn't heard that before, but okay. And then didn't think too much about it, and then I guess 2 or 3 years ago, there was another teacher on Facebook put out a video basically kind of making that same point. And so it comes up, and it's a question that, needs to be addressed, because if we want to do what's in the Word, we want to do it right. So I want to take a look at that today, and I'm calling this when you enter the land. And so the idea is there are certain things, certain commandments that the Scriptures say when you enter the land, do X, Y, Z. And so, the question is like, okay, well, do those commands only apply when we're in the land, or do they apply across the board whether we're in or out of the land? And so we're going to take a look. What I did with this study is I pulled every scripture I could find. I searched for the phrase enter the land, and I searched for every scripture I could find that dealt with a commandment, okay, because there's lots of stuff, so-and-so enter the land, that has nothing to do with the commandments, right? And I also did a search for just in the land, because when you enter the land, where are you? You're in the land, right? So I pulled all the scriptures I could find that talked about keeping commandments in the land, just to kind of see logically where it goes. Like, are there certain commandments that we keep in the land and certain commandments that we don't, or do we just apply the logic across the board? So we're going to read a lot of scripture today. That's why I encourage everyone to take a break before we got started, because this could be 3 hours. Not really. No. We'll probably go an hour and a half max. Hopefully not 2, but there is a lot of reading to do. So, and I want to leave room at the end for questions, comments, and strong opinions as usual. So, the first thing we look at when we go to when you enter the land as a phrase is Passover. And so we'll start in Exodus chapter 12. And just as part of our logical application, we're going to take note of when and where the commandments were given. Now, this commandment is given in the land of Egypt, more specifically in the land of Goshen, which is not in the land of Israel. So we'll take a look and see how that applies, if it does, as we go through. So Exodus 12, we'll just read 21 through 28 once I get there. Okay. Then Moses called for all the elders of Israel and said to them, "Go and take for yourselves lambs according to your families and slay the Passover. You shall take a bunch of hyssop and dip some of the blood that is in the basin to the lintel and 2 doorposts, and none of you shall go outside the door of his house until morning. For Yahweh will pass through to smite the Egyptians, and when he sees the blood on the lintel and on the 2 doorposts, Yahweh will pass over the door and will not allow the destroyer to come into your house to smite you. And you shall observe this event as an ordinance for you and your children forever. When you enter the land," there it is, "when you enter the land, which Yahweh will give you as he has promised, you shall observe this rite. And when your children say to you, 'What does this rite mean to you?' You shall say, it is a Passover sacrifice to Yahweh, who passed over the houses of the sons of Israel in Egypt, when he smote the Egyptians, but spared our homes. And the people bowed low and worshipped. Then the sons of Israel went and did so, just as Yahweh had commanded Moses and Aaron, so they did. So this is the first mention of being told to keep a commandment in the land. So when you enter the land, do this thing. And he's, just as a time marker, the command is being given before they enter the land, which we'll talk about that as we go. And we know from the Passover account that bare minimum they kept this command year 1 in Egypt and then year 2 at Mount Sinai. There's speculation on did they do it or not in the 40 years in the wilderness, because we know that when they came into the land, a lot of them had to get circumcised. And we know that you don't keep Passover according to the command unless you're circumcised. So there's debate on whether or not they actually kept Passover while they were traveling. But we know for sure that they kept the first 2 Passovers outside the land at least 40 years, 40, 41, 42 years or whatever it was prior to actually entering the land. Okay, so next place this is mentioned is in Leviticus 23. And these first couple of mentions are specifically about Passover. They just come up chronologically in the text this way. Well, sort of. So Leviticus 23, we're just going to read the part about the wave sheaf offering. And that is starting in verse, we'll just start reading in verse 9. Then Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, When you enter the land which I am going to give you to reap its harvest, then you shall bring in the sheaf of the firstfruits of your harvest to the priest. He shall wave the sheaf before Yahweh for you to be accepted. On the day after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it. Now on the day you wave the sheaf, you shall offer a male lamb 1 year old without defect for a burnt offering to Yahweh. Its grain offering shall be 2/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with oil, an offering by fire to Yahweh for a soothing aroma, with its drink offering 1/4 of a hin of wine. Until this same day, until you've brought in the offering of your Elohim, you shall eat neither bread, nor roasted grain, nor new growth. It is to be a perpetual statute throughout your generations in all your dwelling places. And then he starts talking about the counting of the omer. So this is the second time we have a commandment to do something when we enter the land, and it's offering the wave sheaf. Now, just thinking about this one specific commandment, could they keep this command when they were in the desert for 40 years? I don't think, unless they had a wheat crop or something, they could not have kept the wave sheaf offering. So just on a can we apply this? Yes, they could do Passover outside the land because we know they did it twice at least. This specific command, we know that they could not have done it before they entered the land because they had no crops to offer. So it makes sense on this one, you literally cannot do this until you enter the land because you have nothing to offer. Okay? So we're just going to take a look at each of these as we go through and just kind of ask these questions. And just kind of as another point of logic, in Leviticus 23, this is the only one he says when you enter the land. He doesn't say when you enter the land you'll keep the weekly Sabbath. He doesn't say when you enter the land you'll keep the Passover, even though he did earlier. We just read that. He doesn't say when you enter the land you'll do the Day of Atonement, etc., etc. So this is, to me, kind of a practical thing. Because, like I said, you can't keep this command unless you have a crop. Now, if we say logically, okay, if that's the issue, then in theory, if you have a crop, even if you're not in the land, you could still theoretically do this. Okay, so now we're going to look at those are the first two that come up, and they're specifically with Passover. Now we're going to stay in Leviticus, but we're going to go back a little bit. We're going to go to Leviticus 14, and this is leprosy. And this is going to be interesting. So in each of these, we're going to ask ourselves, does this apply? Does it make sense that we only keep this command in the land of Israel? Or is there a reason why we would only keep this in the land of Israel? And I think as we go through this, we're going to get slightly different answers for kind of each of these things. It's not so black and white. There's some nuance. So we're going to read Leviticus 14, 33 through 35. Yahweh spoke further to Moses and to Aaron, saying, when you enter the land of Canaan, when you enter the land, which I give you for possession, and I put a mark of leprosy on a house in the land of your possession, then the one who owns the house shall come and tell the priest, saying, something like a mark of leprosy has become visible to me in the house. The priest shall then command that they empty the house before the priest goes in to look at the mark, so that everything in the house need not become unclean. And afterward the priest shall go in to look at the house. So he shall look at the mark, and if the mark on the walls of the house has greenish or reddish depressions and appears deeper than the surface, then the priest shall come out of the house to the doorway and quarantine the house for 7 days. The priest shall return on the 7th day and make an inspection. If the mark has indeed spread in the walls of the house, the priest shall order them to tear out the stones with the mark in them and throw them away at an unclean place outside the city. He shall have the house scraped all around inside, and they shall dump the plaster that they scrape off at an unclean place outside the city. Then they shall take other stones and replace those stones, and he shall take other plaster and replaster the house. So we'll just stop right there because that's enough to get the idea. So can we think of a reason, because he said when you enter the land, do this commandment in regards to having leprosy in the house. Is there a reason why they could not have kept this command before they entered the land? They didn't have a house, exactly. They were in tents. The tents were either some kind of textile or they were some kind of leather. So he's talking about actually having stones and timber. Okay, so this makes sense, because they don't actually have houses until they enter the land and they have a degree of peace where they can build those houses. Okay, so if we're applying that same principle, in theory, any place we have a house, any place we have a structure that could get house leprosy, whatever that is, I tend to think like in modern times we think of black mold. Black mold is like the bane of every householder's existence, because it costs a lot of money to get that stuff out of your house. And I know people whose health is just completely tanked, and you see stories online of people that just have these chronic illnesses and they don't know what's going on, and all of a sudden they figure, oh, I've got black mold in my ceiling tiles. They have it removed $14,000 later and everything's okay. But anyway, so this commandment could be kept anywhere you have a house, okay? So let's go to Leviticus 19, and we're going to read verses 23 through 25. Leviticus 19, 23 through 25. When you enter the land and plant all kinds of trees for food, then you shall count their fruit as forbidden. 3 years it shall be forbidden to you, it shall not be eaten. But in the 4th year all its fruit shall be holy, an offering of praise to Yahweh. And the 5th year you are to eat of its fruit, that its yield may increase for you. I am Yahweh your Elohim. So this kind of goes back to what we said with the wave sheaf offering. He says when you enter the land, I don't think that they had fig trees traveling around with them when they were in the desert. So just as a practicality, they could not have kept this commandment until they got into a place that had trees with fruit. So if we apply this to ourselves, we don't have to be in the land to have trees with fruit. And this is something that we've been dealing with because we planted some fruit trees a few years ago. And we've got, I forget which one it is, we've got one tree I think that's 5 years old. And so the question is, well, can we eat that fruit? Well, it hasn't even really put on fruit yet. So it's already after year 5, so if it puts on fruit, can we eat that? And the way I read this, no, I think it's fruit crops. And so there might be some interpretation on that, but the way I see it is year 1 when it bears fruit, you skip that. Year 2, you skip it. Year 3, and then year 4, it does say that that's holy to Yahweh. Now, if we had a functioning, temple and Levitical system, it doesn't spell it out, but to me it makes sense that maybe they would bring that crop as a tithe to the Levites. For us, practically, we're just going to skip the 4th year too, and then when year 5 comes in, then we'll eat of that fruit. But this is a command that can be kept if you have a fruit tree, regardless of if you're in or out of the land. And so these are some of the kind of logical things we're going to look at as we go through each one of these commandments. So, Numbers 15. Numbers 15. Wait, is that right? Numbers 15 isn't, oh, that's Leviticus 15. Let's go to Numbers 15. All right. Yeah, here we go, Numbers 15. I'm going to read the whole chapter, or at least a good chunk of it. Now Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, When you enter the land where you're to live, which I'm giving you, then make an offering by fire to Yahweh, a burnt offering or a sacrifice to fulfill a special vow, or as a freewill offering, or in your appointed times, to make a soothing aroma to Yahweh from the herd or from the flock. The one who presents his offering shall present to Yahweh a grain offering of 1/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with 1/4 of a hin of oil. And you shall prepare wine for the drink offering, 1/4 of a hin with the burnt offering, or for the sacrifice for each lamb. Or for a ram you shall prepare as a grain offering 2/10 of an ephah of fine flour, mixed with 1/3 of a hin of oil. And for the drink offering you shall offer 1/3 of a hin of wine as a soothing aroma to Yahweh. When you prepare a bull as a burnt offering or a sacrifice to fulfill a special vow or for peace offerings to Yahweh, then you shall offer with the bull a grain offering of 3/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with 1/2 a hin of oil. And you shall offer as the drink offering 1/2 a hin of wine as an offering by fire, as a soothing aroma to Yahweh. Thus it shall be done for each ox, or for each ram, or for each of the male lambs, or of the goats. According to the number that you prepare, so you shall do for everyone according to their number. All who are native shall do these things in this manner, in presenting an offering by fire as a soothing aroma to Yahweh. Now that all who are native is going to come up as we go through this. We're going to revisit that. If a stranger sojourns with you, or one who may be among you throughout your generations, and he wishes to make an offering by fire as a soothing aroma to Yahweh, just as you do, so shall he do. As for the assembly, there shall be one statute for you, and for the stranger who sojourns with you, a perpetual statute throughout your generations. As you are, so shall the stranger be before Yahweh. There is to be one law and one ordinance for you and for the stranger who sojourns with you. Then Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, When you enter the land where I bring you, then it shall be that when you eat of the food of the land, you shall lift up an offering to Yahweh. Of the first of your dough you shall lift up a cake as an offering. As the offering of the threshing floor, so you shall lift up. From the first of your dough you shall give to Yahweh an offering throughout your generations. But when you unwittingly fail and do not observe all these commandments, which Yahweh has spoken to Moses, even all that Yahweh has commanded you through Moses, from the day when Yahweh gave commandment and onward throughout your generations, then it shall be, if it is done unintentionally, without the knowledge of the congregation, that all the congregation shall offer one bull for a burnt offering as a soothing aroma to Yahweh, with its grain offering and its drink offering, according to the ordinance, and one male goat for a sin offering. I'm reading all of these details for a reason, so bear with me. Then the priest shall make atonement for all the congregation of the sons of Israel, and they will be forgiven. For it was an error, and they have brought their offering, an offering by fire to Yahweh, and their sin offering before Yahweh for their error. So all the congregation of the sons of Israel will be forgiven, with the stranger who sojourns among them, for it happened to all the people through error. So there's a mechanism here for even a Gentile who's in with the people. This would be somebody like a Ruth. We talked about this idea before, the idea of a ger, somebody who's a non-flesh and blood Israelite who decides to do the whole Romans 11 thing and graft in. They have the same law apply to them, including the same opportunity for forgiveness as a native-born Israelite. So verse 27, Also if one person sins unintentionally, then he shall offer a 1-year-old female goat for a sin offering. The priest shall make atonement before Yahweh for the person who goes astray when he sins unintentionally, making atonement for him that he may be forgiven. You shall have one law for him who does anything unintentionally, for him who is native among the sons of Israel, and for the stranger who sojourns among them. But the person who does anything defiantly, whether he is native or stranger, that one is blaspheming Yahweh, and that person will be cut off from among his people. Because he has despised the word of Yahweh and has broken his commandment, that person shall be completely cut off, his guilt will be on him. And this is just kind of a sidebar, but I think it's important to mention here. Different translations will say different things here, but the idea is this is basically sinning on purpose. This is when you know what the Torah says and you intentionally do the opposite or something different. Now, I'm going to raise my hand and say I'm guilty of this. I'm not going to make you guys do it, but I would bet that pretty much everybody in this room at some point has intentionally sinned. And so if I was to stop right here, where's our hope? We're all cut off. We know where our hope is. We know where hope is. And this is what Hebrews is talking about. When he talks about for the person that sins intentionally, there's no longer a sacrifice. There's no sacrifice. You can read all through, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. You won't find a single offering that you can bring for intentional, willful sin. And yet there has to be a mechanism. So anyway, I just wanted to say that. So what he's talking about here with these sacrifices, this harkens back to Leviticus 1 through 6. And so Leviticus 1 through 6 is where he goes through all these different types of sacrifices in detail. So like your sin offerings, your free will offerings, your whole burnt offerings, these kinds of things. And the reason why I think that's relevant is because he gave the commandments for those sacrifices before they entered the land. And they had a tabernacle that they were doing the sacrifices with before they entered the land. So this is relevant because they were doing it before they entered the land. They didn't wait until they got into Israel and crossed the Jordan to start doing these offerings. So when he says, when you enter the land, do these offerings, logically we could say, when you enter the land, keep doing these offerings. When you enter the land, don't stop doing these offerings. And that's a theme that I think we're going to see as we go through this, is it's this whole idea of, like, if you have a child, like if I have a teenage child, which I have a couple, and I say, okay, I want you to do, X, Y, Z things, work really hard, get your math really good, have good grades, and then I'm going to give you, I don't know, a Dodge Challenger, okay? And so let's say my son, he turns 16. He works really hard. He does everything he needs to do. He fulfills it, and I give him that Dodge Challenger. And then after he gets the car, he just starts slacking. Grades go back down. So I think that kind of where we're going with this, just to kind of get to the punchline, is he's basically saying, when you enter the land, keep doing my ways. Just because I give you the promise, just because I bring you into the land that I promised to your fathers, doesn't mean you stop doing my ways. Because that's human nature. When we get what we want, we tend to not do anything else. We tend to just get complacent because why bother? We already got the payout. Some of us have to learn that lesson the hard way, especially when we're younger. But I kind of think that when we look at all of this in context, that's kind of why he talks about when you enter the land, do specific things. So let's go to Numbers 34. This one's going to be kind of obvious why this one is a when you enter the land. Numbers 34, I'm just going to read a little bit here. Then Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, command the sons of Israel and say to them, when you enter the land of Canaan, this is the land that shall fall to you as an inheritance, even the land of Canaan according to its borders. And then he spends the whole rest of the chapter spelling out how they're going to divide the land. Okay, so obviously you can't keep this commandment outside the land because it doesn't work. So this is one of those commands that, like some of them you could keep, like the sacrifices, Passover, things like that, you could keep before you enter the land, even though he said to do it when you enter the land. This is one of those ones that you can't do until you enter the land. So that one's pretty basic. We're going to spend a lot of time in Deuteronomy, so we're going to start there now. Deuteronomy 17. Deuteronomy 17. And as we go through this, if I was exhaustive, as exhaustive with this as I could be, with translational differences and things, if you guys see scriptures that I missed, feel free to bring it up, because searching for phrases, and I even do the whole thing, because when I was a kid, I was around nerds because I was a nerd, and we learned about what do they call it, the Boolean search or whatever, where you put it in quotes, and because I use Blue Letter Bible, and if I just put enter the land, I'll get scriptures where enter, and then there's 8 words, and then there's and then land might not even be there. You put it in quotes, and it gives you those 3 words in that exact combo. So that's what I did. But it's possible that maybe other translations say territory instead of land or whatever. I could have been looking for the wrong English word. So that is possible. So Deuteronomy 17, we'll read verses 14 through 20. Deuteronomy 17, 14 through 20. When you enter the land which Yahweh your Elohim gives you, and you possess it and live in it, and you say, I will set a king over me like all the nations who are around me. You shall surely set a king over you whom Yahweh your Elohim chooses. One from among your countrymen you shall set as a king over yourselves. You may not put a foreigner over yourselves who is not of your countrymen. Moreover, he shall not multiply horses for himself, nor shall he cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses. Since Yahweh has said to you, you shall never again return that way. He shall not multiply wives for himself, or else his heart will turn away, nor shall he greatly increase silver and gold for himself. Now it shall come about when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself a copy of this law, this Torah, on a scroll in the presence of the Levitical priests. It shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear Yahweh his Elohim by carefully observing all the words of this law and these statutes, that his heart may not be lifted up above his countrymen, and that he may not turn aside from the commandment to the right or to the left, so that he and his sons may continue long in his kingdom in the midst of Israel. Now, this is one of those commands that's interesting because it's got every command has some kind of principle behind it. And when we start looking at the principles, that's where we can get a little bit subjective, and there's kind of more variation in opinion. But when we look at the literal, if you have a king of Israel, and it says when you enter the land, like they didn't have a human king when they were wandering in the wilderness those 40 years. And we know that when they were kicked out of the land later, they had human kings, but they weren't Israelite kings. They were Babylonian, they were Assyrian, okay? And so this is one of those commands that in the literal, yeah, it doesn't make any sense outside the land. As a principle, any ruler, I wish our rulers would do this. I would love it if our rulers would actually sit down and write copies of this book and actually pay it heed and give it some attention. We wouldn't be anywhere near this dumpster fire that we're in currently. So I hear all of y'all saying amen. But it's a principle, and the principle applies anywhere. It's a good principle. But the literal enactment of this for Israelites doesn't make sense outside the land. So this is one of those ones where, yes, when you enter the land, yeah, it kind of makes sense that it doesn't really apply in the literal when we're out of the land. Okay, so Deuteronomy 18, we're going to read 9 through 22. Deuteronomy 18, 9 through 22. And this is one of those ones when I looked at it, the one verse popped up, but it kind of keeps going. So I wanted just to kind of read the whole block, because grammatically, it's possible that you could have the one scripture, the one verse that's when you enter the land, or it could say that and then keep going. So I just want to read the whole thing for context just to make sure we catch it. When you enter the land which Yahweh your Elohim gives you, you shall not learn to imitate the detestable things of those nations. There shall not be found among you anyone who makes his son or his daughter pass through the fire, one who uses divination, one who practices witchcraft, or one who interprets omens, or a sorcerer, or one who casts a spell, or a medium, or a spiritist, or one who calls up the dead. For whoever does these things is detestable to Yahweh, and because of these detestable things, Yahweh your Elohim will drive them out before you. You shall be blameless before Yahweh your Elohim. For those nations which you shall dispossess, listen to those who practice witchcraft and to diviners. But as for you, Yahweh your Elohim has not allowed you to do so. Yahweh your Elohim will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your countrymen. You shall listen to him. And this is basically saying, instead of going to mediums and spiritists, I'm going to send you prophets. He's basically saying, this is going to be the method of communication I'm going to use with you people. Don't go to the witch at indoor. Don't do that whole thing. I'm going to send people to you. And of course later on he has the commandment about, I will send you a prophet like Moses. It's similar to this, but it's not the exact same one. But where were we? So let's see here. So 15, Yahweh your Elohim will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your countrymen. You shall listen to him. This is according to all that you asked of Yahweh your Elohim in Horeb on the day of the assembly, saying, let me not hear again the voice of Yahweh my Elohim. Let me not see his great fire any more, or I will die. Yahweh said to me, they have spoken well. I will raise up a prophet from among their countrymen like you, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. It shall come about that whoever will not listen to my words, which he shall speak in my name, I myself will require it of him. But the prophet who speaks a word presumptuously in my name, which I have not commanded him to speak, or which he speaks in the name of other Elohim, that prophet shall die. You may say in your heart, how will we know the word which Yahweh has not spoken? When a prophet speaks in the name of Yahweh, if the thing does not come about or come true, that is the thing which Yahweh has not spoken. The prophet has spoken it presumptuously, you shall not be afraid of him. And of course, we have artificial chapter breaks in our Bibles. He keeps right on going through 19. But we start off with that command in verse 9. When you enter the land which Yahweh your Elohim gives you, you shall not learn to imitate the detestable things of those nations. So as a point of logic, is this a command that they could have kept prior to entering the land? Like in other words, the 40 years in the wilderness, was it okay to learn the ways of these pagan nations because they hadn't entered the land yet? I would say no. And then if we extrapolate that out, is it okay to learn the ways of the nations when you're out of the land? I would extrapolate that and say no. So I think where he's going with this is like I said earlier, when you get in the land, don't get complacent. Don't start to absorb the ways of the nations around you, because it's really easy to assimilate with the crowd. And, they were surrounded by Canaanites, Moabites, Edomites, all of these different people around them who were doing this crazy stuff, And so, the idea is you guys stay holy. Just because you're in the land doesn't mean you get the slack. I still want you to be holy. So Deuteronomy 26, we'll read 1 through 11. Deuteronomy 26, 1 through 11. Then it shall be, when you enter the land which Yahweh your Elohim gives you as an inheritance, and you possess it and live in it, that you shall take some of the fruit of all the produce of the ground which you bring in from your land, that Yahweh your Elohim gives you. You shall put it in a basket and go to the place where Yahweh your Elohim chooses to establish his name. You shall go to the priest who is in office at that time and say to him, I declare this day to Yahweh my Elohim that I have entered the land which Yahweh swore to our fathers to give us. Then the priest shall take the basket from your hand and set it down before the altar of Yahweh your Elohim. You shall answer and say before Yahweh your Elohim, my father was a wandering Aramaean, and he went down to Egypt and sojourned there, few in number. But there he became a great, mighty, and populous nation. And the Egyptians treated us harshly and afflicted us and imposed hard labor on us. Then we cried to Yahweh, the Elohim of our fathers, and Yahweh heard our voice and saw our affliction and our toil and our oppression. And Yahweh brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, and with great terror and with signs and wonders. And he has brought us to this place and has given us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Now behold, I have brought the first of the produce of the ground, which you, O Yahweh, have given me. And you shall set it down before Yahweh your Elohim, and worship before Yahweh your Elohim. And you and the Levite and the stranger who is among you shall rejoice in all the good which Yahweh your Elohim has given you and your household. When you have finished paying all the tithe of your increase in the third year, the year of tithing, then you shall give it to the Levite, to the stranger, to the orphan, and to the widow, that they may eat in your towns and be satisfied. How far was I going to go? 11. I went a little bit farther. Okay. So this is interesting to me, because obviously it says when you enter the land, they're going to bring first fruits offerings. And like we said earlier, if you don't have an agricultural crop to offer, you can't do this. So it makes sense that this one has to wait until they enter the land. But the other thing is, the person is supposed to say, I declare this day, this is verse 3, Yahweh my Elohim, that I have entered the land which Yahweh swore to our fathers to give us. So this one, if I read the whole thing, I think it's talking about when they very first entered the land, like that first generation. Because if I enter the land as that first generation and my kids are born in that land, can they say they've entered the land? They were already in the land. So to me, when I read this seems like maybe a one-time thing potentially. It doesn't seem like it's a recurring thing, because we're not entering the land every single year. Does that make sense? So Deuteronomy 27, we'll go a page over. We're going to read 1 through 10. Deuteronomy 27, 1 through 10. We're roughly halfway through this. Then Moses and the elders of Israel charged the people, saying, keep all the commandments which I command you today. So it shall be on the day when you cross the Jordan to the land which Yahweh your Elohim gives you, that you shall set up for yourself large stones and coat them with lime, And write on them all the words of this law when you cross over, so that you may enter the land which Yahweh your Elohim gives you, a land flowing with milk and honey, as Yahweh your Elohim, the Elohim of your fathers, promised you. So it shall be when you cross the Jordan, and you shall set up on Mount Ebal these stones, as I am commanding you today, and you shall coat them with lime. How far was I going to go? 1 through 10, okay. Moreover, you shall build there an altar to Yahweh your Elohim, an altar of stones. You shall not wield an iron tool on them. He's hearkening back to Exodus 20. You shall build the altar of Yahweh your Elohim of uncut stones, and you shall offer on it burnt offerings to Yahweh your Elohim. And you shall sacrifice peace offerings and eat there, and rejoice before Yahweh your Elohim. You shall write on the stones all the words of this law very distinctly. Then Moses and the Levitical priests spoke to all Israel, saying, Be silent and listen, O Israel. This day you have become a people for Yahweh your Elohim. You shall therefore obey Yahweh your Elohim and do his commandments and his statutes, which I command you today. And that's as far as I was going to go. So this is talking about when they come into the land, set up the altar there at Mount Ebal, and then basically write the Torah on it, like in the stones. So to me, this is kind of like what we read before. This is kind of a one-time thing. You don't enter the land every year. So the generation that entered the land keeps this commandment. So this is a command I'm not really worried about keeping, whether I'm in the land or not, because it's already been done. Some of this might seem redundant, but I just wanted to be thorough and catch all of these. So now, that's all the scriptures that I could find that talk about when you enter the land. Now we're going to transition into commandments that talk about just being in the land. Do this commandment in the land. We're going to go back to Exodus 20. And to me, like when I read scripture, what's not said is just as important as what is said. And this is kind of one of those things, in kind of an indirect way. And we could say that about a lot of the stuff we read already. We're going to read verse 12. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be prolonged in the land Yahweh your Elohim gives you. So I was talking with somebody earlier, I forget who it was. If I just slow down and think through this, he says the reason why we're supposed to honor our mother and father is so that our days can be prolonged in the land he's going to give us, meaning the land. So if I'm not in the land, is it to my benefit to keep this commandment? Is it okay for me not to honor my mother and father because my days being prolonged in the land of Israel is irrelevant to me? I don't know if anybody's thought through it that way, but to me, honoring your father and mother is a command that we should keep regardless of where we're at. It just so happens that if we keep that command while we're in the land, it benefits us. And I tell the kids this sometimes, like honor your father and mother there's different ways to interpret that. Like, does it mean obey? So like as an adult, when I became an adult and I started to come down this road of keeping the Torah, keeping the Sabbath, my parents didn't come with me. So am I supposed to keep this command by doing things their way? Am I supposed to obey them? So like as an adult, if my parents say, don't keep the Sabbath, you're supposed to go to church on Sunday. Do I do that to honor this command? Or do I honor the command by living in a way that brings honor to my parents? That's kind of the way I frame it. And I believe that if we keep the words of this law, if we do it with an upright and contrite spirit, we do bring honor to our parents. They may not recognize it, but in the eyes of Yahweh, I do think it brings honor to the family. That's just kind of a way I process it because it just makes it more livable, I guess, and it takes that subjective nature out of it. Grown-ups obeying other grown-ups. So Leviticus 14, we're going to read 33 through 35. Leviticus 14, 33 through 45. Wait, did I already read this? Yeah, I read this same chapter. Yeah, we read this earlier. This is talking about the leper's house. I don't know why I have it doubled up. It talks about it twice in this chapter. We can skip that one. We'll go back to Deuteronomy. Everything, I don't know if anybody's done Blue Letter Bible, but to me, the way they have the graphics, it kind of starts to kind of run together after a while, especially when you have like multiple tabs up, because that's how I do it. I've got like 14 tabs up, a blue letter. So anyway, so we don't have to read that one. It's the same exact thing we just read, just a different spot in the chapter. We'll go back to Deuteronomy 4. We'll do Deuteronomy 4. Deuteronomy 4. And we're going to read verses 1 through 40. Deuteronomy 4. 1 through 40, which is almost the whole chapter, but I'll spare you, and we'll shave a few verses off the end. Now, O Israel, listen to the statutes and the judgments which I am teaching you to perform, so that you may live and go in and take possession of the land which Yahweh your Elohim of your fathers is giving you. You shall not add to the word which I am commanding you, nor take away from it, that you may keep the commandments of Yahweh your Elohim which I command you. Your eyes have seen what Yahweh has done in the case of Baal Peor. For all the men who followed Baal Peor, Yahweh your Elohim has destroyed them from among you. But you who held fast to Yahweh your Elohim are alive today, every one of you. See, I have taught you statutes and judgments, just as Yahweh my Elohim commanded me, that you should do thus in the land where you are entering to possess it. So he's talking about a broad swath of commandments here. He's not, in this specific text, he's not mentioning specific commandments. So he's basically talking about like all these things that I'm commanding you, you're supposed to do in the land which Yahweh is going to give you. So this kind of logical application is, well, do we say because we're out of the land, all of a sudden we don't listen to what Moses says here? So let's keep going. Verse 6, so you keep and do them, for that is your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the peoples who will hear all these statutes and say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. For what great nation is there that has an Elohim so near to it as Yahweh our Elohim whenever we call on him? Or what great nation is there that has statutes and judgments as righteous as this whole law which I am setting before you today? Only give heed to yourself and keep your soul diligently, so that you do not forget the things which your eyes have seen, and they do not depart from your heart all the days of your life, but make them known to your sons and your grandsons. Remember the day you stood before Yahweh your Elohim at Horeb, when Yahweh said to me, assemble the people to me, that I may let them hear my words, so that they may learn to fear me all the days they live on the earth, and that they may teach their children. You came near and stood at the foot of the mountain, and the mountain burned with fire to the very heart of the heavens, darkness, clouds, and thick gloom. Then Yahweh spoke to you from the midst of the fire. You heard the sound of words, but you saw no form, only a voice. So he declared to you his covenant, which he commanded you to perform. That is the 10 Commandments, and he wrote them on 2 tablets of stone. Yahweh commanded me at that time to teach you statutes and judgments, that you might perform them in the land where you are going over to possess it. So he's talking about, he mentions the 10 Commandments specifically, but he's also using this phrase statutes and judgments. And this is one of the things we see, everybody's probably picked up on it. When he refers to his overall Torah, he talks about laws, commandments, statutes, and ordinances. And some people have done, really deep dive studies. I know Eddie Chumney's done one where he really gets into this. And I've seen charts broken out like this commandment is an ordinance, this commandment is a statute. I've seen that whole kind of thing. I don't have the brain power or even the willpower to go through that, to be honest. That's a lot. But it is a way that the Torah is divided, And in modern times, we hear about, well, there's the moral law, there's the civil law, and there's the ceremonial law. That's not what our scriptures say. That's a way for us to pick and choose which commandments we want to keep. Because if I say, well, we only keep the moral law, well, who defines which commandments are moral? Moral just means the right thing to do. So if I say, well, anything Yahweh tells you to do, do it, because it's the right thing to do. So they're all moral laws at that point. Anyway, so where was I? That was in verse 15? Okay, thank you. So watch yourselves carefully, since you did not see any form on the day Yahweh spoke to you at Horeb from the midst of the fire, so that you do not act corruptly and make a graven image for yourselves in the form of any figure, the likeness of male or female, the likeness of any animal that is on the earth, the likeness of any winged bird that flies in the sky, the likeness of anything that creeps on the ground, the likeness of any fish that is in the water below the earth. And beware not to lift up your eyes to heaven and see the sun and the moon and the stars and all the host of heaven, and be drawn away and worship them and serve them, those which Yahweh your Elohim has allotted to all the peoples under the whole heaven. But Yahweh has taken you and brought you out of the iron furnace from Egypt to be a people for his own possession as today. Now Yahweh was angry with me on your account and swore that I would not cross the Jordan and that I would not enter the good land which Yahweh your Elohim is giving you as an inheritance. For I will die in this land, in the land of Moab. I shall not cross the Jordan, but you shall cross and take possession of this good land. So watch yourselves. And this is the point that I think he's overall making. He's saying, when you're in the land later, I want you to do these things. I want you to obey the commandments and the statutes and the ordinances that I, Moses, am giving you. And he's telling them why. Because he knows he's not going to enter the land. Once he's out of the picture, then he's got no say over how they behave. So he's trying to prep them for what's coming. And so he says, watch yourselves, verse 24, that you do not forget the covenant of Yahweh your Elohim, which he made with you, and make for yourselves a graven image in the form of anything against which Yahweh your Elohim has commanded you. For Yahweh your Elohim is a consuming fire, a jealous Elohim. When you become the father of children and the children's children, and have remained long in the land, and act corruptly, and make an idol in the form of anything, and do that which is evil in the sight of Yahweh your Elohim, so as to provoke him to anger, which they wouldn't do if they were obeying the words of Moses while they're in the land. I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that you will surely perish quickly from the land where you're going over to the Jordan to possess it. You shall not live long on it, but will be utterly destroyed. Yahweh will scatter you among the peoples, and you will be left few in number among the nations where Yahweh drives you. There you will serve Elohim, gods, the work of man's hands, wood and stone, which neither see, nor hear, nor eat, nor smell. But from there you will seek Yahweh your Elohim, and you will find him if you search for him with all your heart and your soul. When you are in distress and all these things have come upon you in the latter days, you will return to Yahweh your Elohim and listen to his voice. For Yahweh your Elohim is a compassionate Elohim. He will not fail you, nor destroy you, nor forget the covenant with your fathers, which he swore to them. Referring back to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Indeed, ask now concerning the former days which were before you, since the day that Elohim created man on the earth, and inquire from one end of the heavens to the other. Has anything been done like this great thing, or has anything been heard like it? Has any people heard the voice of Elohim speaking from the midst of the fire, as you have heard it and survived? Or has a God tried to go and take for himself a nation from within another nation by trials, by signs and wonders, and by war and a mighty hand, and by an outstretched arm, and by great terrors, as Yahweh your Elohim did for you in Egypt before your eyes? To you it was shown that you might know that Yahweh, he is Elohim, there is no other besides him. Out of the heavens he let you hear his voice to discipline you, and on earth he let you see his great fire, and you heard his words from the midst of the fire. Because he loved your fathers, therefore he chose your descendants after them, or their descendants after them. And he personally brought you from Egypt by his great power. So he keeps going back to Yahweh brought you out of Egypt. Okay? I talk about this idea a lot of coming out of one kingdom into another. We can't be in the kingdom of Yahweh and be in the kingdom of Egypt simultaneously. Geographically, yeah, like in the land of Goshen. Spiritually, absolutely not. They're not compatible. Verse 38, driving out from before you nations greater and mightier than you, to bring you in and to give you their land for an inheritance as it is today. Know therefore today, and take it to heart, that Yahweh, he is Elohim in heaven above and on the earth below, there is no other. So you shall keep his statutes and his commandments, which I am giving you today, that it may go well with you and with your children after you, that you may live long in the land which Yahweh your Elohim is giving you for all time. We'll stop there. Now we know, and Moses prophesied this, you guys are not going to fulfill the covenant. You're going to be ejected from the land. So when that happens, he said earlier that you're going to come back to Yahweh with all your heart. You're going to seek him and he will be found. So does that mean that when we're out of the land, we don't have to keep all these commandments that Moses gave us? And somehow in that environment where we've got it in our minds that we don't have to keep all the commandments of Moses because we're not in the land, somehow in that state, we're going to come back to Yahweh with all our heart and soul. That's logically incongruent to me. Because, we see the same thing in Deuteronomy 30. When all these things that come upon you, the blessing and the curse, and I'm paraphrasing here, and you call all these things to mind, referring to his commandments, then he brings us back from captivity. And so, a people that has no desire to keep his commandments because they think they're irrelevant outside the land is not going to have that response. At least I don't see how. Let's go to Deuteronomy 5, next chapter over. We'll read 22 through 33. Deuteronomy 5, 22 through 33, which is the end of the chapter. These words Yahweh spoke to all your assembly at the mountain from the midst of the fire, of the cloud and of the thick gloom, with a great voice. This is after he just restated the Ten Commandments. And, with a great voice, and he added no more. He wrote them on 2 tablets of stone and gave them to me. And when you heard the voice from the midst of the darkness, while the mountains was burning with fire, you came near to me, all the heads of your tribes and all your elders. You said, Behold, Yahweh your Elohim has shown us his glory and his greatness, and we have heard his voice from the midst of the fire. You have seen today that Elohim speaks with man, yet he lives. Now then, why should we die? For this great fire will consume us. If we hear the voice of Yahweh or Elohim any longer, then we will die. For who is there of all flesh who has heard the voice of the living Elohim speaking from the midst of fire as we have and lived? Go near and hear all that Yahweh or Elohim says, then speak to us all that Yahweh your Elohim speaks to you, and we will hear it and do it. Now, I just want to pause right there because he's verbally said the Ten Commandments. The voice of thunder, everybody heard it. And now Moses is going to speak to Yahweh some more. Yahweh's going to tell him more things, and the people are saying, you go talk to him, and whatever he tells you to do, we'll do that too. Okay, so we're not talking about just the Ten Commandments. Verse 28. Then Yahweh spoke, Yahweh heard the voice of your words when you spoke to me, and Yahweh said to me, I have heard the voice of the words of this people which they have spoken to you. They have done well in all that they have spoken. Oh, that they had such a heart in them, that they would fear me and keep all my commandments always, that it may be well with them and with their sons forever. Which time keeps going when you're out of the land. Go and say to them, return to your tents. But as for you, stand here by me, that I may speak to you all the commandments and the statutes and the judgments which you shall teach them, that they may observe them in the land which I give them to possess. So you shall observe to do just as Yahweh your Elohim has commanded you. You shall not turn aside to the right or to the left. You shall walk in all the way which Yahweh your Elohim has commanded you, that you may live and that it may be well with you, and that you may prolong your days in the land which you will possess. So when we endeavor to keep the commandments, and we have, this is why I take the position, and this is just trying to be as objective as possible. When we see a commandment and we ask ourselves, should we keep it? That's how you end up with 30,000 Christian denominations. That's how you end up with denominations within the Torah movement. Because when we ask, should we, it becomes a subjective. So when we ask, can we, now we're talking more objective. You either can or can't. So if we keep all the commandments that are possible to us, and don't worry about the ones that are impossible to us, that sliding scale of subjectivity is all of a sudden eliminated. And it's an equal playing field. Some people will be able to keep some commandments, some people can't. I use this example sometimes. If you're a firefighter and a fire breaks out on Sabbath, and it's your job as a firefighter to put that house out, do you say, it's the Sabbath, sorry, your house is just gone? It's lawful to do good on the Sabbath. So there are cases, where somebody can quote unquote break the Sabbath because it has to be done. But generally speaking, Sabbath is something that people can keep. There's accommodations legally. Employers have to make reasonable accommodation for people's religious beliefs. And I've talked to people over the years. There's probably 5 or 6 people that I've talked to over the past 10, 15 years. Oh, I have to work on the Sabbath. Da, da, da. Have you asked your boss? No, they're not going to let me. Well, if you haven't asked your boss if you could take off on Sabbath, then you've got to at least ask the question. But just assuming that an employer won't let you off, and then going ahead and working on the Sabbath anyway, you can't keep the Sabbath, but there are things you could do that maybe could make it where you could. So in any case, I think he's talking about here, this whole idea of because he's mentioning all of these commandments. And if we're going to say, let's keep the commandments, let's keep the Torah, if we apply this logically, we're obviously not in the land of Israel. So when he says, do all these things in the land, logically, I can't say, well, I'm out of the land, so I don't need to do all the things that Moses said. It's logically inconsistent. So Deuteronomy 6, we're just going to the hits keep coming here in Deuteronomy 6. We're going to read the whole chapter, and then we're going to go right into 12, and then 19, and then 30. So we're getting done. I appreciate everybody being patient. Deuteronomy 6. Now this is the commandment, the statutes and the judgments which Yahweh your Elohim has commanded me to teach you, so that you might do them in the land where you're going over to possess it. Now this is important because this is the Shema. He's about to invoke the greatest command. And this is in the same context. So we're going to ask ourselves, do we only keep the greatest command when we're in the land? Because it is a commandment. So that you and your son and your grandson might fear Yahweh, your Elohim, to keep all his statutes and his commandments, which I command you all the days of your life, and that your days may be prolonged. O Israel, you should listen and be careful to do it, that it may be well with you, and that you may multiply greatly, just as Yahweh, the Elohim of your fathers, has promised you, in a land flowing with milk and honey. Hear, O Israel, Yahweh is our Elohim, Yahweh is one. You shall love Yahweh, your Elohim, with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your might. These words which I'm commanding you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and you shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontals on your forehead. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. Then it shall come about when Yahweh your Elohim brings you into the land which he swore to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give you, great and splendid cities which you did not build, and houses full of all good things which you did not fill, and hewn cisterns which you did not dig, vineyards and olive trees which you did not plant, and you eat and are satisfied. Then watch yourself. So he's talking about you're in the land, and all these blessings that you did nothing to earn are granted you. He's saying, watch yourself, that you do not forget Yahweh who brought you out from the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Complacency. You shall fear only Yahweh your Elohim, and you shall worship him and swear by his name. You shall not follow other Elohim, any of the gods of the peoples who surround you. For Yahweh your Elohim in the midst of you is a jealous Elohim. Otherwise the anger of Yahweh your Elohim will be kindled against you, and he will wipe you off the face of the earth. You shall not put Yahweh your Elohim to test, as you tested him at Massah. You should diligently keep the commandments of Yahweh your Elohim, and his testimonies, and his statutes which he has commanded you. You shall do what is right and good in the sight of Yahweh, that it may be well with you, and that you may go in and possess the good land which Yahweh swore to give your fathers, by driving out all your enemies from before you, as Yahweh has spoken. When your son asks you in time to come, saying, what do the testimonies and the statutes and the judgments mean, which Yahweh our Elohim commanded you? Then you shall say to your son, we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and Yahweh brought us from Egypt with a mighty hand. He keeps going back to Egypt. Moreover, Yahweh showed great and distressing signs and wonders before our eyes against Egypt, Pharaoh and all his household. He brought us out from there in order to bring us in, bringing us out of one kingdom into another, to give us the land which he had sworn to our fathers. So Yahweh commanded us to observe all these statutes, to fear Yahweh our Elohim for our good always, and for our survival as it is today. It will be righteousness for you, for us, if we are careful to observe all this commandment before Yahweh our Elohim, just as he commanded us. And so immediately in the next chapter we have in the land, but he's talking about what they're going to do with military conquests and things like that. So this is important because Moses has been talking about ever since chapter 4 all of these commandments, all of these statutes, ordinances, laws. You do them in the land. So objectively, do we keep those same things outside the land? We have the question, should we? We have the question, can we? Because you've got, with the whole outside the land, there's one school of thought that you don't have to, and there's another school of thought that you can't. Like if it says in the land, you can only do it in the land, versus you don't have to keep it if you're outside the land. But if we apply this whole thing to the stuff that's in the land, I think we start to see, yes, there are some when you enter the land commandments that can only be done logically in the land, but the vast majority of it is stuff that can and should be done outside the land. So Deuteronomy 12, let's go there next. And I have in it to read the whole chapter. We'll see if we read the whole chapter. These are the statutes and the judgments which you shall carefully observe in the land, which Yahweh your Elohim, Yahweh the Elohim of your fathers, has given you to possess as long as you live on the earth. You shall utterly destroy all the places where the nations whom you shall dispossess serve their Elohim, on the high mountains and on the hills and under every green tree. You shall tear down their altars and smash their sacred pillars and burn their asherim with fire. You shall cut down the engraved images of their gods and obliterate their name from that place. You shall not act like this toward Yahweh your Elohim. But you shall seek Yahweh at the place which Yahweh your Elohim will choose from all your tribes to establish his name there for his dwelling, and there you shall come. There you shall bring your burnt offerings, your sacrifices, your tithes, the contribution of your hand, your votive offerings, your free will offerings, and the firstborn of your herd and of your flock. There also you and your households shall eat before Yahweh your Elohim, and rejoice in all your undertakings in which Yahweh your Elohim has blessed you. You shall not do at all what we're doing here today, every man doing whatever is right in his own eyes. That sounds a lot like what we read in Judges. For you have not as yet come to the resting place and the inheritance which Yahweh your Elohim has given you. When you cross the Jordan and live in the land which Yahweh your Elohim is giving you to inherit, and he gives you rest from all your enemies around you, so that you live in security, then it shall come about that the place in which Yahweh your Elohim will choose for his name to dwell, there you shall bring all that I command you, your burnt offerings and your sacrifices, your tithes and your contribution of your hand, and all your choice votive offerings which you will vow to Yahweh. You shall rejoice before Yahweh your Elohim in you and your sons and daughters, your male and female servants, and the Levite who is within your gates, since he has no portion or inheritance with you. Be careful that you do not offer burnt offerings in every cultic place which you see, but in the place where Yahweh chooses in one of your tribes, there you shall offer your burnt offerings, and there you shall do all that I command you. However, you may slaughter and eat meat within any of your gates, whatever you desire, according to the blessing of Yahweh your Elohim, which he has given you. The unclean and the clean may eat of it, as of the gazelle and the deer. Only you shall not eat the blood. You are to pour it out on the ground like water. You are not allowed to eat within your gates the tithe of your grain, or new wine, or oil, or the firstborn of your herd or flock, or any of your votive offerings which you vow, or your freewill offerings, or the contribution of your hand. But you shall eat them before Yahweh your Elohim in the place which Yahweh your Elohim will choose, you and your son and your daughter, your male and female servants, and the Levite who is within your gates. You shall rejoice before Yahweh your Elohim in all your undertakings. Be careful that you do not forsake the Levite as long as you live in your land. When Yahweh your Elohim extends your border, as he has promised you, and you say, I will eat meat, because you desire to eat meat, then you may eat meat, whatever you desire. If the place which Yahweh your Elohim chooses to put his name is too far from you, then you may slaughter of your herd and flock which Yahweh has given you, as I have commanded you, and you may eat it within your gates wherever you desire. Just as a gazelle or a deer is eaten, so you will eat it. The unclean and the clean alike may eat of it. Only be sure not to eat the blood, for the blood is the life, and you shall not eat the life with the flesh. You shall not eat it, you shall pour it out on the ground like water. You shall not eat it, so that it may be well with you and your sons after you, for you will be doing what is right in the sight of Yahweh. Only your holy things, which you may have, and your votive offerings, you shall take and go to the place which Yahweh chooses. And you shall offer your burnt offerings, the flesh and the blood, on the altar of Yahweh your Elohim, and the blood of your sacrifice shall be poured out on the altar of Yahweh your Elohim, and you will eat the flesh. Be careful to listen to all these words which I command you, so that it may be well with you and your sons after you forever. For you will be doing what is good and right in the sight of Yahweh your Elohim. When Yahweh your Elohim cuts off before you the nations which you are going in to dispossess, and you dispossess them and dwell in their land, beware that you are not ensnared to follow them after they are destroyed before you, and that you do not inquire after their Elohim, saying, how do these nations serve their gods, that I may also do likewise? You shall not behave thus toward Yahweh your Elohim, for every abominable act which Yahweh hates they have done for their gods, for they burn their sons and daughters in the fire to their gods. Whatever I command you, you shall be careful to do. You shall not add to or take away from it. So the bulk of this chapter is talking about when you enter the land and you're going to bring offerings, you're going to bring sacrifices. bring it to the place where Yahweh chooses to establish his name. We know that historically the first place that was at Shiloh. That was the place where the tabernacle was established. Later on, it was moved to Jerusalem. There are other things in here, like don't eat the blood when you eat the meat. You can have a barbecue anywhere within your gates, but don't eat the blood. So if I look at that command and I say, is it okay to eat the blood now that we're out of the land? Because this is part of the package deal of what he's saying when you do this when you're in the land. And then towards the end of this, he's talking again about don't serve the other gods the way the nations do. Is it okay to do that when we're out of the land? And again, I think it's this whole complacency thing. Just because you're in the land and life is great and you're being blessed, be really careful not to backslide. He's a big one. And start doing these things and be influenced by the people around you, because it's really easy to do. Deuteronomy 19, we're almost done. Deuteronomy 19, we'll just read verse 14. Deuteronomy 19:14. You shall not move your neighbor's boundary mark, which your ancestors have set in your inheritance, which you will inherit in the land that Yahweh your Elohim gives you to possess. So he's talking about when you have property in the land you're going to possess, don't move the boundary markers. So is that a commandment that we should only keep in the land, or is that relevant to now? We actually had this happen to us a few years ago. We have, if anybody's been to our house, we have a couple of our property markers that are actually drive shafts. It was like that when we moved in. And one of our neighbors, a couple houses back, one day just decided to take one of those drive shafts. I don't know if he was going to use it on his car or what, but it was just gone. And so we talked to one of our other neighbors about it. We kind of mentioned it. It must have gotten back to him because, like, I don't know, the next morning or 2 days later, the drive shaft was back and we had our boundary marker again. So a neighbor of ours, he didn't move it. He just outright stole it. But whenever we move a boundary marker, what are we doing? We're stealing. We're stealing land. I mean, we could be generous and move the boundary marker in and give our neighbor some of our land, but people don't do that, you know. So that's a command that applies inside or outside the land. You know, just because he's saying in the land, don't move your neighbor's property marker, doesn't mean that when you're out of the land, it's okay to do that. And we're going to just finish up with Deuteronomy 30. And if you know me, you already know I'm going to read the whole chapter. This is my favorite chapter in the whole scriptures because I feel like we're living it right now. So it shall be when all these things have come upon you, the blessing and the curse which I have set before you, and you call them to mind in all the nations where Yahweh your Elohim has banished you, like America, like Kenya, China, you know, all the places his people have been scattered. And you return to Yahweh your Elohim and obey him with all your heart and soul according to all that I command you today, you and your sons, which all that he commands us today, we're at the end of the book of Deuteronomy. He's commanded a lot of things. This is the reason why it's called the law of Moses. It's the law transmitted through Moses. And people are calling that to mind and obeying. Well, so do we pull out the scriptures that talk about in the land and we don't obey those? Moses doesn't make that distinction here. You and your sons, then Yahweh your Elohim, verse 3, will restore you from captivity and have compassion on you, and will gather you again from all the peoples where Yahweh your Elohim has scattered you. If your outcasts are at the ends of the earth, from there Yahweh your Elohim will gather you, and from there he will bring you back. Yahweh your Elohim will bring you into the land which your fathers possessed, and you shall possess it. He will prosper you and multiply you more than your fathers. Moreover, Yahweh your Elohim will circumcise your heart and the heart of your descendants to love Yahweh your Elohim with all your heart and with all your soul, so that you may live. Going back to Deuteronomy 6. Yahweh your Elohim will inflict all these curses on your enemies and on those who hate you and who persecute you. And you shall again obey Yahweh and observe all his commandments which I command you today. Then Yahweh your Elohim will prosper you abundantly in all the work of your hand, in the offspring of your body, and in the offspring of your cattle, and in the produce of your ground, for Yahweh will again rejoice over you for good, just as he rejoiced over your fathers. If you obey Yahweh your Elohim to keep his commandments and his statutes, which are written in this book of the law, a lot of those we just read are ones that say in the land. If you turn to Yahweh your Elohim with all your heart and soul, for this commandment which I command you today is not too difficult for you, nor is it out of reach. It is not in heaven that you should say, who will go up to heaven for us to get it for us, and make us hear it, that we may observe it? Nor is it beyond the sea that you should say, who will cross the sea for us to get it for us and make us hear it, that we may observe it? But the word is very near you, in your mouth and in your heart, that you may observe it. See, I have set before you today life and prosperity, and death and adversity. In that I command you today to love Yahweh your Elohim, to walk in his ways and to keep his commandments and his statutes and his judgments. It's the whole package deal, that you may live and multiply, and that Yahweh your Elohim may bless you in the land where you are entering to possess it. But if your heart turns away and you will not obey, but are drawn away and worship other Elohim and serve them, I declare to you today that you shall surely perish. You will not prolong your days in the land where you're crossing the Jordan to enter and possess it. I call heaven and earth to witness again against you today, that I have set before you life and death, the blessing and the curse. So choose life in order that you may live, you and your descendants, by loving Yahweh your Elohim, by obeying his voice, and by holding fast to him. For this is your life and the length of your days, that you may live in the land which Yahweh swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give them. I love this, because I feel like we're living it. Like I said earlier, we're in this generation where we've been banished all around the world, and we're starting to have a compulsion, a drive to return to Yahweh's ways and actually obey them. And it's interesting because we read some scriptures here where he talks about when you enter the land and you backslide and you go after the other gods and you stop keeping my commandments, then you'll be scattered from the land. And in Deuteronomy 30 here, and there's other places in the scriptures we could go to, he's saying there's going to come a time at the end of that captivity where you're going to start obeying my commandments again. Then I will bring you back into the land. So disobeying the commandments when you're in the land gets you booted from the land. Returning back to the commandments when you're out of the land gets you back into the land. That's a very simplified way to say it, but that's the reduced, reductive message of what we're reading here. Maybe reductive is not the right word. But anyway, so when I look at this package deal, it's more nuanced. It's not just a black and white, we don't keep the commandments unless we're in the land, or we do, or vice versa. Some of them can only be kept in the land. Some of them could not be kept in the wilderness because they didn't have houses, they didn't have crops. But once you enter the land, you have those things, so you can keep those commands. Some of the commands are just universal commands that apply whether you're in the land or not. And so I think when we look at this idea of should we keep a commandment, and people generally put this in terms of the feast. Do we keep the feasts out of the land? But if we're consistent and we say, do we keep the commandments in or out of the land? I think the answer is, for the most part, yes. If we're out of the land, we can keep the commandments, and we should keep the commandments, the ones that are possible to us. Some commandments are just not possible. Like if we're looking at the law of leprosy, yes, I have a house that could have leprosy, but do we have a Levitical priesthood that I can go through that rite to have it purified? I don't have that. If we did, I could keep that commandment. Now, I could still potentially, take the wall out of my house and do all that stuff, but I can't go through the ritual to have it actually purified. So there's a lot of nuance in this. But like I said, generally speaking, just because we're out of the land doesn't mean we don't have to, or we can't do the commandments that apply to in the land. So hopefully that makes sense. I don't know if anybody's really thought about that. It's come up for me a few times over the years, and so I just thought, with us coming through the feast season here, the spring feasts, some have already done Shavuot, some are doing it now, some are coming up, and then we've got that little gap that I kind of dread because I like keeping the feasts, so I'm looking forward to Sukkot already. So the idea is that, when you enter the land, don't get complacent. And I did read it today. If Dave Dombeck were here, I would have really highlighted it because he's our resident bencher. And some of you know what I'm talking about. There's the command that when you enter the land and you've eaten and I don't think it says when you enter the land, but when you're in the land, when you've eaten and are satisfied, then you give thanks to Yahweh. And so, that's a prescription for praying after you eat, and some people do that. And we do that sometimes. But it's the idea that just because you have this blessing, Just because you have this promise that's been fulfilled in some way, don't lose sight of the one that gave it to you. Don't lose sight of the fact that your ancestor was a wandering Aramaean, that your ancestors came from Egypt, from bondage. The commandments keep us tied in with that. They keep us tied in with that legacy of like salvation and deliverance of our Father. And just because we've been given the promised land, not we here, but our ancestors that were actually there, doesn't mean that we just stop doing his ways. Like I said, Passover was given before we entered the land. Sabbath is not one that says, do this when you enter the land, but it is a commandment that was given pre-Sinai. And our mainstream brothers and sisters out there, I wish more people could see that. Sabbath was not like, oh, we got a bunch of Jews gathered around the mountain now, let's give them all these hard, burdensome commandments like Sabbath. Sabbath was given prior to Mount Sinai as a way to test our obedience, but also to give us a principle that shows the Father's provision. And, just like, the animals rest, we rest, everybody rests in the household of Yahweh. So I'm going to close it at that. And at this point, I will open the floor. I have no idea what time it is or how long that took. Did it take me 3 hours? Hopefully not. Okay, good. We'll open the floor now for questions, comments, and strong opinions.